That sound, very iconic for many Amiga users, and it is of course the sound effect that XCopy made when it completed a task. No, this isn't a video about Monkey Island. Hello, I'm Rob, and I guess, like me, the majority of you back in the day didn't realise that XCopy was part of a commercial package, as most of the people I knew used it to sail the 7 seas. There were other copiers however, like Synchro Express, Supercard Ami, Rattlecopy Pac-Man and D-Copy to name a few, some more powerful and some even public domain. But in this video, we're going to take an in-depth look at XCopy, what it did and why it was so popular. We'll have a look at the different releases, including some of the unofficial hacked versions, and we'll take a look at some of the software that came bundled with it. Then, we'll take a deep dive into the different hardware Cyclone dongles that came with it out of the box, how they work, and the different revisions of them, including a special prototype for the Amiga 2000. Finally, we'll have a chat with a former employee of Cachet, so sit tight and get comfortable. Cachet, the name, synonymous with XCopy, being the official distributor for ASI, had the motto, "Anything but the best is failure." You can tell they meant this because of the many revisions of the software distributed over the years. But did you know, back in 1987, when the original XCopy was being developed, the only aim behind it was to be able to back up a floppy disk as quickly as possible? The original version wasn't even a commercial product. It was never, well, officially designed as a piracy tool, and much to most people's surprise, it didn't originate from the piracy, wares or demo scene either, with the exception that the developer behind the main copy routines was previously a member of the hacking group Unit A, which ceased its operation just before XCopy was released. Cachet, however, were very serious about XCopy not being used for piracy, and just for making backups of originals, although there was absolutely nothing they could do to prevent it being misused. So they included notices like this with the various products, this one from the Cyclone manual, but messages like this were also included in some of the advertising as well. In 1998, the first commercial versions appeared, being advertised in mainly relatively new Amiga magazines. Interestingly, even in 1989, XCopy was largely unheard of, which you can tell from these questions in the letter sections of this magazine, asking if the advertised software was actually any good. From 1990, these adverts became a lot larger, although these look like they're being resold by Siren Software in the UK. The advert actually sells the product quite well, and continued to evolve as later versions were released, and we'll take a look at those versions later on. The move to XCopy Professional sees the Cachet logo now featured in the advertising, and being able to copy up to 4 discs in 48 seconds, wow, that's pretty quick. Although I'm guessing that means making 4 copies of the same disc in 48 seconds. This is the last of the large adverts I discovered, although I'm very sure there would be more. For example, I haven't looked at any German magazines, given that's where this product is from. It's got exactly the same wording, but this time in yellow, maybe to make it stand out more. It's interesting to point out that on each of these adverts they make a point of the software being used for backup purposes only, a far cry from what it was used for most of the time. Now, I'd imagine the majority of you didn't realise that XCopy was actually part of a commercial suite of tools, which included Express, a hard disk backup utility, Xlent, a file copier, Exit, a disk encryption program, QED, a text editor, and of course Cyclone. We'll take a look at these tools later on, but first let's take a look at what you might have received when you ordered a copy of XCopy. And I have a few different boxes to look at. And if you remember seeing or owning any of these, then please leave a message in the comments. So the first one we're going to take a look at is from the Retro Computer Museum in Leicester. For those that don't know, they've recently had a devastating flood which has caused loads of damage. If anyone is able to help them, then you can make a donation using the link below, and it's also in video description. Right, let's have a look inside the box. Firstly, a look at the back, which describes the product and advertises the update service available. Once again, it points out that the software must not be used for illegal purposes. So let's have a look inside, and this probably wasn't the exact original contents. The first thing we find is a registration card that's been completed but not sent off, but it does tell us that this box was purchased at the First Computer Centre in Leeds in the UK. Oh, and yes, I have covered up someone's actual address there, and it looks like they had an Amiga 500 Plus with 2 MB of RAM. We've also got this leaflet from the shop itself. It makes me think the box probably wasn't shrink wrapped at all. Underneath we find several discs, The first one, in green, is an official disc, and it contains the April 1993 version of XCopy Professional and its associated tools. There's also 4 other floppy disks in there made by the original owner. They look like they're backups of the main disc. There's also this strange looking dongle. This is a Cyclone dongle, although from the outside it's impossible to know which version, and we'll have a look at this later on. Moving on, and this box was kindly loaned from Retro32. The box itself looks like it's the same one that I've just shown you from the Retro Computer Museum, but it's highly likely to contain completely different content. First we discover a returns and troubleshooting leaflet from the shop that sold this. It kind of looks like this one was a mail order purchase from a company in Swindon in the UK. Moving on, and just like the other box, we've found a registration card, only this time it hasn't been completed. Underneath all of this we can see a whole pile of discs. First up, the one in this plastic case. This one actually contains XCopy Professional from September 1993. Next, we find this white disc distributed by Siren Software in the UK, maybe from one of those adverts we've just seen. And this one contains the April 1993 version again. I'm guessing someone had the subscription service here. Below that, another disc. This one contains the same version again. Finally, below that one is a yellow disc, and this contains a much older version, XCopy 3.1. The other disc has a game on it called something like Oxyd, at least that's how one site suggested I should pronounce that, but we'll take a look at that later on. Lastly in the box are 2 Cyclone dongles. Again, I'm not sure what versions they are, but we'll have a look at these in a bit. Finally, I've zoomed in a little because this box is a bit smaller, and it was also kindly loaned from Retro32. I think this is probably one of the earlier boxed releases of XCopy. The text on the back is exactly the same as the larger boxes, but without the illegal use warning. Inside we find this strange green piece of paper announcing XCopy Professional September 1992. I'm curious where this piece of paper came from because it suggests it's not what's actually in the box. It also shows that Cachet had a registered post office box in Kent in the UK. We also find a letter from Cachet UK Limited explaining what's included in the package. Lastly, 2 discs, one with MK1 written on it and the other with MK2. It's handwritten, or at least it looks like it is. The left hand one with the yellow label contains XCopy 3.3, whereas the right hand one with MK2 written on it contains XCopy September 1992. That's quite the upgrade. These are slightly later versions of the product, as you can tell by the various Cyclone dongles included. But before we get onto those, let's take a closer look at the evolution of just some of the releases of XCopy, and again, leave a message in the comments about which version you remember using the most. We'll start with XCopy 1.2, the earliest version that I was able to track down, released in August of 1988. This version seems to support several modes: DOS copy, DOS copy plus, nibble copy, and finally the check disk option. But only 2 months later a slightly newer version was released, and all of them have that familiar sound right in there from the start. February 1989 sees the release of version 1.3, and unfortunately I don't have any release notes, so I don't exactly know what's changed, but I assume some bug fixes. Sometime later that year, or possibly at the start of 1990, XCopy 2 was released, and this looks more how I remember it looking. It came with some extra features in the toolkit, including fast format and optimize. The new kill sys button was added too. We'll take a look at all these later on. Shortly after we see XCopy 2.1, and this was the first version that starts with a splash screen. It also has the erase disk option. This version also came with a special setup program that ran XCopy in a special way such that you could only select options. Once this version was quit, the setup program would save these settings as the default for the next time you used it. There were several version 2 releases over a short amount of time, and we've kind of seen that from the magazine adverts as well. The last version in this range was 2.9. From just looking at the user interface, it's actually quite difficult to understand what's changed. But given this is also sold as a subscription service, I guess possibly one of the first software as a service type applications, getting regular new copies in the post probably made it feel like you were getting your money's worth. But did you notice all the other tools that came on the disc? On to XCopy 3, and now it's professional. Now showing in the upper left hand corner the colourful Cachet logo. With this version we also get some new features, including disk info, verify, BAM copy, speed check, directory display and quick format. It also now times all operations to brag at how fast they are compared with the competition. you'll notice that when I quit back to Workbench, this version comes with quite a few other applications. More on those later. Now, one thing you might not have known was that XCopy was actually available in more than one language. This is the German version of XCopy 3.3. Even the special XCopy boot block is written in German. This version only seems to have one other main new feature, and that is you can freeze the mouse cursor by pressing the right mouse button. And it also seemed that version 3 seemed to come to its end at version 3.4, but the disk doesn't really contain any information as to what changed. Are you keeping up? There doesn't seem to be any information about an XCopy version 4, so we're going to move straight on to XCopy 5, and there sure were a fair few versions. And starting with the German version, there's a new feature under the Tools menu, Install. Aside from it looking aesthetically like version 3, and based on the copyright written on the screen, it was probably released towards the end of 1990, because by October 1991 we have XCopy 5.1, which starts off with a special menu before dropping into a new turquoise colour version. Weirdly, the Cachet logo has disappeared again, and did you realise you could click on these areas for more information? Version 5 came to end of life sort of mid-December 1991 with version 5.21, sporting another option in the Tools menu, Drives On. One of the non-obvious changes in these versions is that XCopy can identify various boot sector viruses, and the definitions of these are updated in each release. A nice feature to have in an application that could so easily spread them. Also, some of the other tools that came with the application received updates as well. After XCopy version 5, the numbers disappeared. Instead, they switched to labelling them by month and year. Before that, did you know there was a special version of XCopy for the CDTV, released in February 1992? Neither did I. And whilst it clearly lacks a lot of the special features of the regular version, it is without a doubt very recognisable. Anyway, onwards to XCopy Pro March 92, which once again looks almost exactly like the previous version, aside from the new font however. Taking a look at the manual, you can see a whole load of work has actually been done behind the scenes. A lot of bug fixes and issues fixed for various configurations too. Now at this point, the Amiga 1200 hadn't been released, and it's a good job because this version doesn't work on Kickstart 3. Which leads us nicely to September 1992, which does work on the Amiga 1200, but I really don't know what changed aside from that, as the manual still has the text from the previous May version. And that's the boring versions out the way, which leaves us with the Xmas 92 edition, and you can see they started to have a little bit of fun. This special version sports a Christmas theme, with snowmen and presents, while the rest of the user interface is covered in snow. Exiting back to Workbench, you can see this version also came with that game that I mentioned before, which has a little bit of a nod to the Pairs card game, although later levels contain more complex puzzles. I had to guess how to play however, as the instructions are in German, and I can't read that. In April 1993, a new version was released with the new purple theme. Then another version in August, and then another one in September. September comes with the new option WB format, but aside from that, they don't appear to offer any new features, and this leads us nicely to the final Christmas 1993 edition, which sadly I've only got the German version. Now I thought that was the last version, but it appears I was wrong because we have XCopy Next Generation, which you can see running here on my Amiga. To be honest, I don't really like the user interface on this, but there's a few things that can be learned from this disc. Back in Workbench, taking a look at the README, we see the Amiga and PC listed here. Well, here's a PC version of XCopy with completely different options. No nibble copy here, the PC floppy drive controller can't do low-level things like that. And the file copier looks a little bit crazy as well. And if we take a little bit of a look at this double page spread from the magazine PC Joker, and with a quick translation, we can see there's a next generation version available for the PC as well. This article is really interesting as it talks about how it will now bypass the well-known Rob Northern copylock protections. Phew, that sure was a lot of versions, and there's likely more that have been lost to history. Next up, let's have a quick look at the various options within XCopy and what they actually do. Because I think a lot of us that may have stumbled across XCopy on some random disk never actually had the manual. So, let's start with the basic DOS copy, which is a simple disk copier. faster than standard Workbench at approximately 68 seconds per disk, and it only works with standard Amiga DOS disks. If more than 3 errors occur whilst reading a track on the source disk, XCopy will switch to the basic nibble copy mode to try and recover as much information as it can. Because of this, read errors will actually be written onto the target disk as well. DOScopy Plus is like DOScopy, however this version will actually attempt to fix the errors rather than just using nibble copy. BAMcopy Plus is a smart DOScopy Plus. It only copies parts of the disk that are actually being used. This leads us to nibble copy, and this is able to copy many types of disk including IBM PC, Atari ST and Acorn Archimedes, as well as various disks used by musical keyboards. Using this, XCopy can recognise some of the copy protections and is able to copy them properly. But because this works at a much lower level, it takes a lot longer. XCopy doesn't try to understand the structure of the data, it just copies it, synchronising using the index signal of the drive or a match with a suitable sync word. Next up, the tools. Optimise. Well, we'd call this defrag these days. It reorganises the data on the disk in a sequential way to make it load faster. Format, just like Workbench does, only in 36 seconds. It also writes a custom boot block which shows the message no virus on boot block. WB format is the same as format, except this one puts a standard Amiga DOS boot block on the disk. Q format is the same as quick format in Workbench, it only writes to track 0 and track 40, where the boot and root blocks are located. Erase wipes the disk in a really fast way. This does it without applying any formatting to it at all, it just erases it. Install installs a boot block on the disk, and there are quite a few options to choose from, including OFS, FFS, bootable or not, or the XCopy boot block. Speed check checks the speed of the drive, and data on the disk that's inserted will be wiped, so only use this with blank disks. Drives on tricks the Amiga into thinking there were actually 4 floppy drives connected, allowing you to use one that wasn't switched on or connected at boot. And finally, kill sys, which frees up memory by closing and removing the operating system from memory. On a 1MB machine, this meant you could copy an entire disk to RAM in one go. Now, did you ever have a disk and you copied it and instead of getting zeros you got some strange numbers instead? Well, firstly the colours. A number in green means that a normal Amiga DOS track was read. A blue number means a non-standard Amiga DOS format was detected and understood. A yellow 0 means a track was written successfully, and a grey track means that a known copy protection scheme was detected and copied successfully. And red, well, we don't like seeing those are errors, and they are as follows. 1 means less than or more than 11 sectors were detected. 2 means there was no sector sync found. 3 means there was no sync after the gap found. 4 means there was a checksum error in the sector header. 5 means there was an error in the sector header. 6 means there was a checksum error in the sector data. 7 means that a long track was detected, and this can't be written using XCopy. And finally 8, verify error. Well, I think that speaks for itself. So that's the majority of the official versions, but there were also many unofficial hacked versions. The reason I didn't realise XCopy was a commercial tool was because the version that I had, XCopy 3.4, whilst looking normal, displayed the message Endless Piracy 1991 when it finished. Leave a comment if you saw any of these, or indeed saw one that I didn't mention. Anyway, here's another one. This is the special 99 track version of XCopy, and it even comes with its own crackthrow at the start. It's almost identical to XCopy 2, however it's been modded so the end track can go all the way up to 99. I'm not sure why this was done, no Amiga drive could ever possibly read that far, but then sometimes these things were just done because you could. It also made itself memory resident, so you had to power off to boot something else. Here's a version of 2.2, but the logo in the upper left hand corner has been replaced with Pendec. It also allows copying up to 89 tracks, 10 short of the other version. Again, why would you do this? Here's another version, messed with by Pendec again. This is actually XCopy 3 but with a slightly modified design, and some greetings scrolling away. Here is the non-existent XCopy 6.4 by Quasar of Liberty. Seems to be mostly just graphical changes to advertise their BBS. They also did a 6.7 version as well. And this is the mighty XCopy 8, because that really didn't exist. This has a complete redesign of all of the graphics, and the credit screens are full screen as well. Interestingly, they left some credit in there for Cachet, including their address, and a suggestion to actually purchase the original. And here we have TrashCopy 7.2, which ironically is based on the unofficial XCopy 6.4, it's very crazy. And lastly, here's a modern one with music, and those that know where this came from. In some ways, this is more of a nod to the original version, as well as the cracking and demo scene. There's actually two versions of this depending on where your nostalgia hits, and there's an excellent write-up explaining how the audio was added. Links can be found in the video description. So that's XCopy done, but there were several other tools and utilities that came as part of the full package, and we're going to take a quick look at them now. I'll be skipping Cyclone for the minute because I'm going to do a deeper dive on that later on. So let's start with having a look at xlent, which was a simple file commander style program, a bit like a basic version of Directory Opus, allowing an alternative way to manage files from within Workbench. It also had custom assignable buttons at the bottom. Then there was also xlent Pro, which features a more professional and perhaps more modern design. Next up, Exit, a floppy disk encryptor program. You start by choosing the start and end tracks that you want to encrypt, with options such as bit rotation and reversing tracks, swapping the sides, and finally scrambling the data with a password, which results in a completely unreadable disk in Workbench. The only issue is to descramble or decrypt the disk, you need to remember the exact set of parameters you used to actually encrypt the disk with in the first place, which, as you can see here, I didn't, and the disk is still unreadable. Next, there's QED or Quick Editor for the Amiga programmer. It's a text editor designed with speed in mind. The software had extremely fast cursor movement, but maintained extremely smooth scrolling by synchronising the display with the CRT. This program is mostly command driven, so you need to know what the keyboard shortcuts are to control it. However, there's a full manual included on the disk. Then we have Disk Copier. I'm not exactly sure why, when you have XCopy on the disk, you need another disk copier. Maybe this is useful if you want to stay within Workbench whilst copying disks. It does have a special redate option, however. Moving on to Xpress, a hard disk backup utility, backing up at the file level and optionally setting the archive flag once complete. The software would manage and handle spreading the backup over several disks if required, and finally storing the directory on a special tree disk. Which brings us nicely onto the last remaining utility, Cyclone. The problem with XCopy on its own is there are some types of disks that just can't be backed up. I'm showing here XCopy failing to back up Turrican 2. This is because it uses long track protection. If you remember on our error sheet, a 7 means a long track was detected. These are impossible to write on a standard setup, even with the advanced nibble copy mode. It successfully recognises that they're long tracks but can't do anything with them. No point in letting this complete because there's absolutely no way this is going to work. Enter Cyclone, the XCopy twin system, which, as you saw during the unboxing, requires a special hardware dongle to be connected between your Amiga and an external floppy drive. And this is one of the early original version 1 dongles, known as the original or passive dongle. We'll take a closer look at this shortly. The drawback with the original dongle is that whilst connected, Workbench can't use your external drive, and as you can see here, it's showing DF1 with some question marks, and I haven't even got a disk inserted. Also, Cyclone can't perform any kind of verify operation either, an issue which was remedied in later versions of the dongle. And before we try out the software, let's take a closer look at those other dongles. So I have all 4 dongles in front of me. Firstly, in the middle, you can see the one I started with. This was sent to me by our special guest that we'll meet later on. But looking closer at it, all you can see is it's rerouting some of the tracks between the 2 sets of connections. And I don't actually need to reverse engineer this, because it became somewhat public knowledge fairly quickly. And as you can see, with this disk, there's a picture showing you how to build your own. Although, the irony now, the 23-pin D connectors are somewhat more expensive now than they were back then. We'll go through the actual wiring in a minute, but first, let's take a look at the other 3 dongles. So, this one on the left here is another passive dongle, a little bit larger. I suspect the smaller one was either an early model or a prototype. What's really interesting is that written on the PCB is the word Siren. Did Siren Software manufacture their own Cyclone dongles, I wonder? On to the next dongle, and this is one of the newer active dongles. Notice the chip in the middle. That's a GAL16V8. It's a programmable logic chip, and it's somehow managing the remapping of the pins in a dynamic way. Aside from that, I don't actually think it's doing anything else, and whilst it may be possible to extract the logic from the chip, that would mean desoldering it, and this isn't mine. On to the last dongle, which appears to be another active dongle version 2, although it's not identical to the other one. This one actually has the date of the 2nd of February 1992 written on it, and the traces are laid out completely differently. However, at a quick glance, I think it's actually wired up exactly the same as the other one. So let's take a closer look at how they're wired up, because from that wiring diagram it really wasn't clear at all. This is a representation of the floppy drive port on the Amiga, and here's what all the pins do. You'll notice that there's only a select 1, 2 and 3, but no 0, as that's directly wired to the internal drive. This connector represents the other side of the dongle where you would connect the external floppy drive. And in a normal configuration it would all just be wired pass-through like this. However, if the Cyclone dongle did this, it would be totally pointless. The majority of these signals still do pass through unaffected, as you can see, so we'll ignore these and focus on the ones that actually change. Firstly, we have the Amiga's disk change signal receiving the index signal from the drive. I'm wondering if this is a sneaky way of detecting the dongle. Then we have the select drive 2 output going to the disk write enable input. That pin actually enables writing to the disk. Finally, the Amiga disk read data input is connected to the disk write data input. Now, with floppy drives, excluding the select lines, all the drives share the same common connections. So in this case, the read data line is actually acting as an output. This means the Cyclone dongle is technically doing nothing more than a tape-to-tape recording. Who did this with their game cassettes on systems like the Commodore 64? The only problem with doing this is as you keep copying the data, the signal slowly degrades. And this is what it sounds like after it's been copied 5 times. That's more noise than actual music in there. But the read and write signals are digital, I hear you cry, so how can they degrade? Well, they don't in the way that audio does, but they do become less and less accurate and more noisy when compared to the timings of the original disc. Here is a recording from track 0 upper side of an original Lemmings disc showing part of the Rob Northern copy log. And here it is again after being copied with Cyclone 5 times. The first copy would probably have been okay, but not the 5th. The build-up of noise mainly comes from the slight timing variations of the motor spinning speed for both of the drives. For those audio aficionados, the flutter and wow. And this is why it's very important that the two drives are spinning as close to the same speed as possible. And that's why there's a speed test option within XCopy and Cyclone. The other reason for the noise is due to the lack of any pre-compensation applied when writing the disc. This is about writing those little magnetic pulses slightly earlier or slightly later than they actually fell, so that they actually land in the right spot on the disc. It's something that would be really easy for us to do today, but would have required some extra logic in the dongle to achieve this back then. Apparently, it was deliberate to prevent piracy, because it prevented copying a copy, although you would still need a Cyclone dongle anyway, as it didn't actually remove any copy protection. So, now you've seen how it works, let's take a look at it in operation. I've plugged in the dongle dated from 1992, so I'm going to start up Cyclone and we'll have another go at backing up that Turrican 2 disc. I saw very briefly it identified the dongle as a T2 dongle, and as you can see, it doesn't appear to be having any problems whatsoever with this disc. I'll speed this up a little, but the real proof will be trying out the disc and seeing if it boots. You'll note that I've switched out using my Rocktech drive to the original one I had when I was younger. Unlike those Rocktech drives, this one doesn't have a belt inside, so it actually works a lot smoother. And as the copy has finished, we're going to reboot the Amiga and cross our fingers. And it's booting. And I'm going to have to mute the music here or I'll get a copyright strike, but it proves it works. Now, Cyclone, just like XCopy, has a number of different copying modes too, so let's take a look at them. We've got standard nibble copy mode, the default option. Then there's deep nibble mode. That's simply described as a stronger and more detailed option that unfortunately significantly increases the copy time. Next up is APWM nibble mode. And I know PWM stands for pulse width modulation, so I'm guessing the A maybe is Amiga? Not sure, but this option apparently attempts to correct between differences of the source and the destination drive by controlling the motor signal. This is usually only recommended for specific troublesome tracks, rather than the entire disc. I'm going to test this out shortly. After that, we have index copy, which uses the drive's index signal to try and synchronise the two drives, as well as locate the track gap. Next we have an APWM version of index copy. After that, we have an option to try and work out the speed of the drive. If you can adjust them, then this is useful to get the two drives spinning as close to the same speed as possible. The last option is wipe disk, same as the one in XCopy. The Cyclone manual states that Cyclone will only work properly when the destination disk has been erased first. One less obvious option is you can press V on the keyboard to toggle verify if you have the version 2 dongle. I've also discovered this very large text file on one of the XCopy discs, which, whilst in German, includes a detailed list of what techniques and settings are required to back up some of the commercially available games of the era. The APWM modes look interesting, although I do actually wonder if it's really possible. After all, the drive is supposed to self-regulate its speed, so let's get my oscilloscope hooked up and we'll check. So, I've got the scope connected to the motor control pin and I'm starting nibble copy with APCM. And the line goes to low, which is the motor being on. Almost straight away the screen shows a distance to APWM lock with a number that's initially increasing. It's obviously doing something, as you can see these small pulses when the motor is off, although given they're about 600 milliseconds apart, about 3 revolutions, I can't really see how it would make that much of a difference. Once the distance value reaches around 300 hex, the pulses start to look a bit thinner. And I'm wondering if it's actually doing this to slightly shift when the disc hits the index position. It could be that it's attempting to correct the disc's actual rotation position to allow the two drives to be spinning more synchronised. Now, there's one more dongle you haven't seen, because all of this was fine if you had an Amiga 500. But what if you had a big box Amiga, like the one behind me? Well, there's 2 options. One is that you can connect an external drive just like before, and there's a button you can press to make Cyclone use that drive instead. However, they also made an internal version that you could install inside your Amiga between the floppy drive and the cable. And here is one of the original prototypes of the Amiga 2000 internal Cyclone dongle, kindly provided by a special guest who will feature shortly. We don't even know if this works or not, so let's get it on the bench and have a closer look. So, this is the prototype, and there's a few differences. First, the main PCB board looks like a proper normal PCB, but then it's got a second PCB kind of bodged on the top. It's also hiding another chip under there. That chip turns out to be the 74LS14, which is a hex-smit trigger inverter chip. To keep it simple, that's kind of just like 6 NOT gates. I'm not sure why it's there, and I don't want to pull this apart to find out why, but I've taken some close-up pictures for you. It looks like only one of the NOT gates is actually being used, along with a glass diode hiding in there as well. And yes, before anyone says the GAL chip is socketed, and no, I can't extract the code, it's protected. And here it is, installed in my Amiga 2000. It took me a while to work out which way round it should be connected, because there's no markings for pin 1 on the dongle anywhere. And yes, on my Amiga 2000, the right hand drive is actually DF1, the second drive. I didn't bother recording it in operation because, well, it's not very exciting, and you've already seen one of these dongles working, but it does actually work and it is detected as a normal Type 2 dongle. Amazing! Awesome, right? That dongle and the other pieces I was sent will be donated to the Retro Computer Museum in Leicester, so if you want to see them, then you're going to have to visit. Anyway, moving on, and on the 26th of December 2011, a copy of the XCopy source code was discovered, dated September 1992. It was discovered by the Software Preservation Society, or SPS, while ingesting the complete ASI and Cachet XCopy master disk archives. Once discovered, it was released on the internet for preservation by our special guest, Christian Bartsch, and I hope I pronounced his name correctly. So, let's meet him. Hello Christian, thank you for taking the time to speak to me today.
Hey Rob, how are you?
You've got a very interesting story to talk to us today, but I wanted to start with, first of all, how did you get into computers? What was your first computer that you had?
Oh, that's a trip down memory lane. My dad, I think it must have been in 82 that he brought home a C64 and decided to do important work-related stuff on this new machine. So to him it wasn't a gaming machine, it was for work, but obviously at some point I noticed you could also run games on it. So I actually kept using the Commodore machine, the C64, until I was able to get my first Amiga, which must have been in late 89 or 90. And the interesting fact is that that very day that we went to the store to buy the computer, I was actually trying to buy an Atari ST. So this is because the extended family in Luxembourg, they had an Atari. And to me, that was the go-to connection, talking about games, utilities to use. So I had a very good insight into the Atari scene by then. You also needed people to get software from, because when you're still in school, you can't afford buying every game and software. So That was the original plan, but that guy in that shop where we wanted to buy the Atari was so arrogant that at some point I was really fed up waiting, because I was always trying to, to get someone to talk to me and to buy a computer, and I had like $1,500 in my pocket. So at some point we left and we went to another electronics store, and they had the Amiga 500 bundle with, I think it was like 5 applications, games, including really crude Kingsoft, Pinball Wizard and Quibi stuff, and also the monitor, right, included. And of course, on demo, they had Deluxe Paint with the Tutankhamun image, which was really impressive. I kept using the Amiga for a couple of years. I then switched to a 1200, which to me still was always like, yeah, it's nice and it's got those enhanced graphics, but I kept the 500 just because I liked it so much. I think I had 2 megabytes of fast RAM. I had an external hard disk attached. I had the action replay, which was just gorgeous if you were trying to mess with software. And then at some point I got a PC. The first one was a 286, then 386, 486, and then the next one in the late 90s was a Pentium laptop from Toshiba, which I kept using for a couple of years, and then I just switched to standard PC stuff, and including a Mac, which I use for video editing. This has actually been my journey. I've always been using other computers for business stuff, like using a Mac in the early 90s already, but this is just the computers that I had myself.
So we can see on your t-shirt a very familiar logo that a lot of people from the Amiga scene will recognise. At some point you worked at Cachet. Is it pronounced Cachet or Cachet?
Cachet is correct. It's actually from, I think it's a novel. I don't know the name. Klaus, who was running the company, apparently just liked the sound of it and chose to use it. In hindsight, I think it was one of the worst decisions to have for Cachet, because especially in Germany, people always called it Cachet, which always sounds like, yeah, no, this isn't right. But Cachet is the right name, and I think I started working for Cachet in 91 or 92. I started trading games with friends, and at some point I noticed that if you'd be getting an original copy, it would be coming in those gorgeous boxes with the manual included and everything. And I usually got my games for 10 German Deutschmarks back in the day. I got a Diana Sisters sitting on my shelf, which I bought for like $5 back in the day. And I know it gives a lot of people grief knowing that I got it for almost nothing, but that was over 30 years ago. So yeah, I started collecting games, and those games actually led me to what I think many of us experience, to the situation that you find, yeah, it's impossible to copy that game just because it's using copy protection. So I delved into that because I found it interesting to see what those companies did to actually achieve the copy protection. And in contrast to those major copy protection schemes, Longtracks or the Rob Northern copy protections, which were like off-the-shelf copy protection, you could just buy it and you'd be having it in your game. So I delved into that, and of course at some point I noticed there was a software package around called XCopy and Tools, which would come with a variety of software that would allow you to do this. So I started fiddling around, and I got the action replay. I could just load the boot track and take a peek at what it was doing and to see, okay. And then especially if you had the option to freeze the game with the action replay, you could actually see when you heard that grinding noise and you knew that the disk head was actually going to that very track that was going to have the protection, you could just freeze and then see where it was. So that then gave me the option to use XCopy and also Cyclone to try and see what I could do to actually create a copy for me. And at some point I had amassed so many games that I started doing a little database. Then I started sending this to Cachet and letting them know, look, I think this should be coming with a product. At some point I was invited to, I think it was in 91, and it was the Amiga fair in Frankfurt. Klaus, who was running the company, invited me to the booth and said, yeah, what you're doing is great, so we've decided to include that with XCopy. And because it's so great what you're doing, and because you let us know that you'd like to become part of the family, we said, yeah, you can now do the Cyclone and XCopy hotline. And because of that, we've printed the new manual, and this is it. And as you can see, this got your phone number right here, and people can call you. I was like, yeah, I was 16 turning 17. So that phone number that they printed into the manual was my mom's phone number. And I let Klaus know, look, you just burned my mom's phone number. And he was, yeah, it's not an issue. We are going to get a new one. Klaus was always like the guy that sorted things the easy way. Okay, we burned the landline. We are just going to buy a new one. So this is when I started working for Cachet. I wasn't asked if I would like to work, or at least it was like, look, we printed your number into that manual. So people are going to call you anyways. So you're not working for us. And this is how the whole journey started.
So, you started off providing that support, and was that what you continued to do, or did your role develop while you were there?
Yeah, I mainly worked on the copy information sheet, as we called it. I also got introduced to the team, so I could submit my feedback from using the product to the guys doing XCopy and to the guy doing Cyclone. Whenever there was a vacation, because the company was in southern Germany and I'm more in midwestern northern Germany, I just hop on a train and go to Heidelberg, and the company was near Heidelberg in Östringen, and they actually had rented a house for the people working for the company. Sometimes I was the first one coming in, and then a day later more people came in. People from the UK came in, so they had programmers from the UK. To me, this was like I was 17, I was in that house, and there was a guy from the UK. I had no other option than actually to speak with him in English, because he didn't speak German, which led to the situation that we were going to the theaters, and I had to explain the movie to him. My grades in school actually went up because I was spending my vacation with that guy from the UK in Heidelberg. To me, it was like doing what I wanted to do, what I would have done anyways, but at the same time getting paid for it. Same goes for doing the hotline at home, where people could call me because we had hotline hours, and all I had to do was like being at home, sitting in front of my computer and doing stuff I liked. And when the phone was ringing, yeah, okay, pick up the phone, give out the information that was needed, and continue doing what you'd like to do. So this is what we did at Cachet, and it got even better after that because the company then relocated their official headquarters to the Caribbean. Klaus, who was running the company, he was actually there from time to time. And when he wasn't there, then somebody else would need to be there to look after the house. So from time to time, people would get the assignment to do their job in the Caribbean.
Awesome.
So, and I remember my summer vacation 94, where I was just informed, yeah, you are actually going to the Caribbean. And I left on the first day of the vacation, hopped on the plane, straight to New York, be there for 2 days. I mean, we just turned 18, and you are in the Big Apple alone with a friend. After that, we went to the Caribbean, had some fun, went to reggae festivals, ate great food, had great rum, drove around the island, which took like 45 minutes on a motorbike. And after that, I was sent to the assembly in Finland. And I flew back on a Sunday evening, came back home and went to school on Monday. So,
wow.
That was like 6 weeks not being at home just because of Cachet. And that was super fun.
Yeah, it sounds like it was a real fun place to work. So going back to XCopy for a second, it wasn't created to help piracy, but obviously it was massively used for it. What was the company sort of feeling about how it was used?
Yeah, this is a question that comes up all the time, but in pure honesty, a lot of tools can be abused. XCopy's intention was to, first of all, to be a reliable solution to create a copy of whatever data you might be having. The basic idea was to just produce a great set of tools to enable people to manage their own data, to duplicate it, to sort it. You know, we had XLent, Norton Commander is what most people associate with it, like a two-pane file browser. We had a word processor, maybe it's like an extended notepad, so it didn't have like, you know, all the spell checking stuff that you'd be having today. It was actually synced to the vertical beam, so it was buttery smooth. There was a lot of thought and a lot of effort going into those applications. The companion application for XCopy was Cyclone, which was the analog copier. It would actually allow you to also copy protected media. But, and this is something that was a technical limitation, but also fit the philosophy that Cachet had, because it was an analog process of duplicating the disk. The copy was of inferior quality than the master. But if you'd be trying to do another copy of the copy, that wouldn't work. It's two things in one. It's a technical limitation. At the same time, we do what we want to do. We enable people to create a safety copy, but you can't use it to do mass piracy. I think this is a very good explanation of what the company's standing was. Of course, we knew it was being used to pirate software, but also at the same time, XCopy was the software that itself was the most pirated piece of software on the Amiga, because A lot of people were using XCopy without ever buying it. And Cachet was very well aware that it was everywhere, and also that a lot of people were like trying to do cracked versions of XCopy, which still surprises me to this day because it didn't have any copy protection at all. So seeing people putting out new versions with changed graphics or logos in it, XCopy was being pirated, XCopy was being used for piracy. Cachet never did something what others did, like removing manual check. So we never put out a software that would actually modify the game, which is true for, I think, one game, Kickoff 2, because I think that actually has a copy protection. If you had something that was like weak bits, that couldn't be duplicated. So, and I think Kickoff had something like that. And I think Cachet cheated by actually identifying the game while doing a copy and then patching a little bit on the copy to make sure it wouldn't break. I think this was the only instance where that was done. It still kept the original copy protection to that extent that you'd not be able to further copy the game, but this is the only instance I know of where actually XCopy would modify the software.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly had, I think the very first version of XCopy I had definitely wasn't an official one, because when it finished copying, one of the messages that came up was something like endless piracy or something. So I didn't know it was an official package, and I certainly didn't know about all the other applications that came with it. A lot of people probably just didn't know, and I think even to this day, a lot of people don't realise that there was a commercial package there. And I don't know how many sales would have been gained by people knowing that.
I don't know. The only thing I know is that we had a very loyal and happy user base. So Cachet was offering a so-called service package. I mean, this was very modern back in the day because it was a subscription service. You'd be paying each year for at least 4 shipments. So that meant getting 4 versions of XCopy, which is the reason why there are so many. And if you look at the XCopy shrine, I found so many of them. The reason was there needed to be 4 versions each year. Usually it'd be coming with a couple of goodies, including shirts. You also got the printed manual, and you could get an updated version of the Cyclone hardware. You know, initially we had those small ones right here. Later on they switched to the more elaborate PCB ones and the active ones. But this was the idea, to say, okay, you are paying us each year to pay for the ongoing development of the software package. And usually people renewed every year. But we were also distributing software. Cachet did Doom, a lot of software sales via the German teletext. Cachet would be having like 2 or 3 pages on teletext where you could buy software.
So moving on from Cachet, after that you spent several years teaching at the SAE Institute in Germany before moving on to working for the Turbine Media Group. During this role, you worked on restoring many classic films for DVD release. Was there any particular films you remember working on that stood out more than any others?
I wanted to work in the games industry, but to me it felt like games had grown out of hand. You were having hundreds of people for a single game. And by the time I wanted to be in the games industry full time, it was like a CD-ROM. And I thought, okay, this is not what I wanted to do. So I took a quick stint into journalism, stopped at the radio, and then decided, okay, I found it strange that those guys working there needed a technician to cut their own interviews and other stuff. So actually every editor had a cutter that would like help him edit his stuff. And I felt like, okay, I want to do this on my own. So this is what I did, and which ultimately brought me to SAE Institute, where I taught video editing, but also I was doing a couple of things in the multimedia course. And then I always liked film at home. I always appreciated home theater stuff. So DVD after Laserdisc, which was a really niche format, was a revelation to me. So I invested into DVD. DVD could be anamorphic, so you could have real widescreen on a disc. But the first Titanic that came out was just letterbox, so it was 4:3 with thick black bars at top and the bottom. And watching this on a 16:9 television meant you had to zoom in. So this ultimately led to the situation that I had an online magazine where I was writing about DVDs with a couple of friends. And at some point I met a German DVD producer who was upset about me always complaining about German DVD releases. This was Phil from Turbine. And this is when I got asked, because you've been criticizing me that often, would you like to help doing interviews, doing B-roll, just helping that we have more bonus on our disc, because this was my major complaint. And this ultimately then led to me like switching my job and just finding that this is something I wanted to do and working on film. Speaking of films that we've worked on, we've done so many over the years that it's hard to pick that film that would be a major difference. But if there's one where you'd be asking me where I have a special connection to that film, then it's probably also the Blues Brothers, where we were able to extend the German dub, because there is the theatrical version and the extended version. And we had the support of John Landis. I actually got to book the original voice actors that did the original dub in 1981, and we actually extended the dub, so for the first time ever, people were able to see that film in a fully dubbed version. The most impressive part about this is that the guy that does Dan Aykroyd, he was also the German dubbing voice for Arnold Schwarzenegger, Sylvester Stallone, Terence Hill, Nick Nolte, and I could just go on for another minute here. It was interesting working with him in the studio, because having this guy that was such a pro in the studio and working with him, and then still standing up to him and saying, okay, I think the last take was a little slurred in the end, can we just redo that? And he was like looking at me, a nitpicking asshole, right? And he meant this in a very flattering way, but this is something that always sticks in my mind. Just remembering doing this and having the opportunity of working with great people, directors and talent, having something different every day. That is just the other side of what I do in the digital side of things, preservation-wise, where it's about games. So I just like to work on the stuff that I grew up with, and working on great films is, I would say, as great as working on great games.
So getting a little bit more up to date, in recent times you've become an account manager at Kryoflux. Now I understand, according to their website, the Kryoflux preservation technology was founded in 2010 to distribute technology by the Software Preservation Society, or SBS. The Kryoflux device is a well-known and respected piece of hardware for accurate low-level preservation of magnetic disks. Can you tell me a little bit about what it was like to work there and the sorts of things you've done while you've...
Yeah, I think for this we have to go back to probably 2001, when the Software Preservation Society was founded, and the idea of this project of individuals all around the globe was to start preserving software. Something that is pretty common today wasn't common back in 2001, because few people were actually thinking about preserving floppy disks, probably because they had still been around. But technically, floppy drives were already out of business, I'd like to say. So what Softpress did, and this was, and it still is, the mission statement, preserve games in an unaltered and authentic way. So the idea is thinking of the Mona Lisa, of an image, of a painting, to preserve it as is, without graffiti. And I'm coming back to what you said earlier, when you said those XCopy version that you had, which when the copy was finished, it'd be giving you a status message that said like eternal piracy or something?
Something along those lines, yes.
So this is something that we would call digital graffiti, because the original work has been altered and graffiti has been applied. So it says something that it shouldn't say. It looks different than it was done by the original artist, author, painter, whatever it was. So speaking of games, the idea was to preserve games in an unaltered and authentic way. No graffiti, no high scores saved to disk, no modifications. To save the data as it was delivered to the consumer on the original disk back in the day. And to do that, you obviously also need to ingest the copy protection, which was present on those disks. Originally, this was done with Amiga computers, because the Amiga doesn't have a floppy controller. By not putting a floppy controller into the Amiga, Commodore saved cost, but also at the same time were pretty flexible in what they could do with a floppy disk. And because of that, the Amiga was the perfect machine for software preservation and also preserving its own copy-protected disks. Because reading them is not as much as an issue as writing them. Because the clock in the Amiga is going to give us cells of 2 microseconds, and you can't change that. But you can read it because it adapts to shorter pulses, and shorter pulses on a track mean you can put more data, you can produce a long track. So because of that, the Amiga itself was the best machine to actually image disks. Now to bridge to Kryoflux. This Kryoflux happened I think we started in 2007. So the original idea was, Softpress was already preserving software with Amiga. We knew that the Amiga would be dying. So we said, okay, we want to have a different solution. And I thought, okay, it's now 2007. There should be a way to do this with modern technology. Now I'm not a hardware designer, I just had this idea. So later in 2007, Rich Applin resurfaced on English Amiga board. And he said, sure, it should be pretty easy to do something like that. And he just snooped around and found a development board that be using an ARM CPU with a lot of IOs to then connect a floppy drive to it. So the first version that was designed, we had some kind of development connection from Münster in Germany to San Francisco, where Rich lived at the time. he didn't have a floppy drive anymore. So he just designed this thing. I built the same prototype on my end. So he'd be doing the software. He'd be sending me a new software version. I'd be hooking this up to a floppy drive, putting in a floppy disk, and ingesting the data, sending the data over to him. He'd be looking at the data, saying, okay, there's a problem with it, and sending me new software. I was just standing by, so I'm just making sure that Rich deserves all the credit here. After a couple of weeks back and forth, we had a working proof of concept. Then Rich said, okay, he didn't have any further plans of diving into this. And then Istvan, who is the head of the Software Preservation Society, took on the proof of concept and said, okay, this is working. And then we did a completely new code base. And then Istvan started doing it in C properly so the code could be ported. And we spent another couple of months software being sent back and forth. I'd be doing a lot of ingesting, a lot of writing to see how it was working. And ultimately, we had a solution that would allow us to ditch what we had on the Amiga with a way higher precision, but with all the knowledge that Istvan had amassed since 2001 up to this day. If I compare what we have for Kryoflux, then I'd say it's 95% software and 5% is the hardware. So all the magic actually happens in the software. And this is something that we still work on. And even though the last software release was in 2018, it's still being actively developed. And I got a new version. It should be out soon. We've actually done a lot of R&D, especially when it comes to reverse engineering disk formats. And people are always like, why does it cost what it costs? And one of the reasons is there's the development on one hand, and then you have all the shenanigans going on when you gotta have a company. Because when you do a product, and initially it wasn't planned to be a product, we just wanted to do this floppy controller. And I said, okay, probably other people also want to have it. And we produced 100 boards initially. We founded Kryoflux in 2010 and did the first batch of boards, was sold out within less than 24 hours. And this is when all the rest happened. We need an accountant. Okay. You need a lot of registrations. You need to register for e-waste, for packaging, recycling. All of a sudden you need a lawyer because you need to have a license. It's the real world. There's a lot of rules that you got to play by. And from then on, we've sold more than 10,000 boards all over the world. This is where this bridges back to the Software Preservation Society. Authentic, unmodified. This is something that matters to all major archives, libraries, museums. You will find that the Kryoflux has a write blocker and other stuff that's really important to them. So we said, okay, we won't be able to distribute all the development costs to people just buying a board. We put this out at cost and then have a professional or commercial or institutional version for those institutions, libraries, archives, museums. So they have a very different price, but they also get a very different support. We still spend a lot of time enhancing the software, and the new version is going to be even more clever with being able to stitch together a path across a track. Because we read so many revolutions of a single track, especially for disks that are error prone and are right at the brink of what we call the digital cliff, it might take 100 reads or 200 reads to get all the bits and pieces together, and then the software needs to stitch it all together. And as you know, there's an area on the disk that is changing for every revolution, which is the gap. A lot of work went into training the software of making it see what it is and being able to identify it, even though this is changing for every revolution, and then finding a path across all these revolutions in parallel and just jumping from all the good ones and leaving out all the broken ones. As I said, 5% is hardware, 95% is the magic, and this happens in the software.
So I understand working with the Software Preservation Society, obviously there's a big push to back up as much software in games as possible for preservation. And these are frozen and stored into the IPF format. Now, I recently made a comment about some games having been cracked and modified to allow them to be stored in this format, and a few examples of IPFs were sent to me as so-called proof of manipulation. Now, one example being Dungeon Master, but what I wasn't told was that Dungeon Master itself had gone through several releases to fix a number of bugs, and they'd changed the copy protection methods used to make it compatible with newer systems, so obviously it would look different from physical discs that I had. As a result of this, I understand that the SPS now holds many different revisions of the same games. Given the multiple versions of these same games over the years, and there's been obviously some unofficial ways to create these IPFs, is there any way to genuinely identify the real ones?
Yeah, the real ones are documented on the software's website. So every IPF has an ID. So if you go on the software's website and click on games, then you can just search the database and see if the ID that you have obviously matches that. We also have internally, we do have hashes for every image so we can identify those. Those images are not technically protected, so people can, if they know how the file structure works, they can modify them. And of course, people can forge IDs. This is something that back in the day nobody thought of. The sole reason that there are IPFs of cracked software is that the original disks had a cracked version shipped in the original box. And the reason for that is that back in the day, when you'd be protecting a game, it was protected. Now, a couple of months later or years later, you want to do a compilation. So you want to put those disks into that compilation box, and then you find it's got a copy protection. Going back to how it worked back in the day, if you'd be, for example, using a Rob Norton copy protection, then this worked by not having the copy protection on the master disk. But when it was sent to replication, you didn't supply the copy protection to the replication plant. Instead, Rob Northern Computing would give them a script for a so-called trace mountain machine that would then be placing the copy protection. Now, if you didn't keep that script, then you'd not be having that. And now a couple of years later, it was probably gone. Companies back in the day would then see, okay, what can we do? And often they found the cracked version. And we know of a couple of releases where those games companies took a crack, had their own team then remove the crack trope. So a couple of those games are actually the cracked versions. So we do have IPFs of these, as well as that we do have IPFs of games that were supplied with a virus. The same is true for Dungeon Master, which was a game by FTL, Faster Than Light, with a copy protection that uses something that we call deterministic weak bits. You have a track that, when you read it, has certain portions that always stay the same, and then there are portions of that track that are written in a way that those bits are going to be different each time you read it. And this is another instance where we have a different version because FTL went belly up and the IP was bought by Psygnosis. And Psygnosis put it out years later, and they didn't use that same sophisticated copy protection. So the IPF that is out there is based on the Psygnosis version. The sole reason for that is it's the latest version there is. It's got all the bugs removed. It's got multi-language. And it made sense because of the deterministic weak bits. Although the IPF format can store raw data, we don't use raw data for preserved images. So we can put raw data, like coming or streaming off the disk and putting it into an IPF for testing purposes. But we said, okay, you can't write that back to disk because if it's raw data, you don't know what it is. This is not how preservation works. All the IPFs that we deem preserved, they do have the proper transport layers in software so that the data is properly defined. And this is in contrast to just having raw data, which you can't verify because you don't know what it is. The IPF is able to properly store and document what the data is so that the writing layer later on knows what to do with the data to make sure that it comes back from disk as it was intended to be read. Because of this, there is no IPF for the original version of Dungeon Master. We do have good raw dumps, which we have verified, but so far no one has had the time to implement the transport layer for a single game. We do have copy protections like the Rob Northern ones where it made sense because there are hundreds of games that use it. Originally, when we did soft press, we had the idea we are going to save the world. You try to do something meaningful, and SPS was doing that, and there were no other groups doing it. Now that we've come up with the Kryoflux, we've enabled a lot of other people, institutions, museums, libraries to also ingest data and to also make sure that the most important tasks that we have today, ingesting data, because it's falling over the digital cliff at one day, doing this now and not tomorrow is important, but we can still look into data in years to come. And also we spent a lot of time and effort on improving what we've created, the system to ingest the data. And at the same time, we see a lot of other projects popping up, also doing software preservation. With all those other people also doing this, the workload is being distributed among all those people. And at the same time, all the knowledge and everything that is there is shared and exchanged. Because of that, we said, okay, there is no rush in regard to this single game. This is why we have the Psygnosis version instead of also having the original one. The problem is that the software we use to create those IPFs, it's ancient. And we currently have the so-called disk tool console, which is the main application and which has a graphical user interface that sits on top of that. The next step is then moving on to something which we call SPS Studio. And this is going to be like a programmer's IDE for floppy data. And this is the next step for doing IPFs. It's an ongoing process, and just being a group of people, and we are less than 10, it's a lot of work if you're doing this in your spare time. Yeah, a lot of time management that we need to do.
Would you have a rough idea of perhaps how many images of games and discs may have been preserved?
The website has 6,500 that are already in the database, and we probably have like 10 or 12,000 in total. There is no huge archive in one place. It's scattered across the world for various reasons. One is data safety. We can't put up this data for download. I wish I could do this. Once everyone dies, this is going to be public. It's not like anyone is hoarding this for personal pleasure. It's just not getting sued. And it's a lot of work these days. And it's a lot of, as I said, forms to be filled. It's a lot of laws that apply. We can't do what we always wanted to, is like push this out and say, look, this is orphaned works. There's nobody that has any commercial interest in this. And even if those companies are still around, and this is a fun part of the story, from time to time, larger corporations reach out to us that ask us if we can supply them with disk images for their own games. From time to time, there are also lawyers reaching out, trying to find out if there's any money to be made. But the big corporations, they know what it is. And as I said, from time to time, they reach out to get a disk image for their own safekeeping and to extract the data, or to do retro console that comes with like 30, 50, 100 games already pre-installed. We never planned to actually start a company. All we wanted to do, like a group of 5, was to do our own floppy controller to be able to read those floppy disks. And the fun fact is that for the first batch that we sold, I had to stop shipping boards after around 50 boxes because my second son was born. So I just had started shipping, and then my wife was like, yeah, we got to go to the hospital. I said, okay. And I think I just posted a note. We just got to postpone the rest of the shipments for another day. So I always know when the company was started, and actually what we did by looking at my youngest son, because he was born that weekend the first boards left my house.
Wow. It's obvious to me that backup and preservation has been a huge part of your life, but what do you like to do outside of this?
I do like music, so I do like going out, which I should do more often, going see bands, concerts. I find some joy in repairing my car. Repairing a car makes sense in 2 ways. One, it's a distraction from sitting in front of the computer and actually using my hands and a wrench and getting dirty. And on the other hand, it saves a lot of money. And yeah, this allows me to sneak in a little stint at right to repair, which I think is also important and also fits this preservation kind of thing that I love and cherish, just because I think people should be entitled to repair what they own. And apart from that, I think I'd also like to travel a little more. I actually find joy in hanging out with people. Also, if it's just a pub, having a good chat over a video is nice. But if I can't have all of this, then one of my hobbies is still, and this is how I got into my job, is I like to see movies. Films still give me joy. And also riding the car. I mean, once I've repaired the car, I'd like to switch to something that is more environmentally friendly, like an electric car. Yeah, I think this sums it up. Music, movies, hanging out with people.
Well, Christian, it's been absolutely amazing to talk to you, and I thank you for not only sharing your thoughts and insight, but your ongoing work with preservation of media. I'd also like to thank you for sending me the pieces of hardware and the t-shirt that I've featured in this video, and I will be donating those to a computer museum for further preservation. Once again, I just want to thank you for your time.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Some very interesting information there, and some very fun memories shared too. The original interview before editing was around 2 hours long, and at some point I will release an extended version that has some fun extra information shared in it. It also plays at a slightly calmer pace. I just want to thank Christian again for chatting with me, sending me those Cyclone dongles, and sending me these cool t-shirts too. Well, that's about it. This sure has been one of the longest videos I've ever made, and it's taken a real long time to put together. And if you want to support me in creating future videos, then consider supporting me on Patreon, just like all these kind people have. I also want to give a shout out to the Retro Computer Museum in Leicester for letting me use their copy of XCopy, and also Retro32 for the kind loan of the other 2 XCopy products you've seen. Links to both of these are in the video description. Anyway, I hope you found that interesting. If you did, give it a thumbs up and share your memories of XCopy. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.